Good morning. Excuse me. It's the weirdest thing, huh? We sit down to do nothing. It can be some of the most enlightened time that you have. Because your mind is trying to go everywhere that it normally wouldn't go or quote unquote shouldn't go. Um, when you're trying to relax, sometimes that can be the time when your mind is the most focused towards what you do or do not necessarily want. Um, I don't really know that I have an angle. I don't really know that I have a goal. I guess once you start looking at your life in a very basic way, you start to realize the things that were important to you in the past versus the things that are important to you now. I guess that's how growing up works, isn't it? It takes some longer than others to get to that point of being able to understand what life is to them, what life is quote unquote meant to be. It's a very interesting concept to me. The possibilities, the perspectives, the ideologies, the theory that everybody has a unique view on the world. No one has a boring story, as it were. Everyone could keep you entertained for at least an hour with just various ramblings from tidbits of their past, things that they've experienced that you have not, but things that you can possibly draw conclusions to or comparisons to. It's interesting that you can compare things that you have done to things that you haven't done, considering how afraid we are of the unknown, but we just kind of fill in the blanks most of the time, hoping that we're somewhat right, rather than actually necessarily asking or trying to experience it for ourselves, because once again, there are some things that we just cannot experience ever. We are given a very specific set of circumstances in our lives. There are thousands, theoretically, of possible timelines as soon as you are born. Those become more and more narrowed down as time goes on. It could be said that one nearing the time of their birth is nearing the process of infinite timelines. And then once they are born, it becomes finite. After that, it goes from possibly billions to millions to thousands to hundreds to tens to eventually a single digit when you start accepting or becoming who you are or quote unquote are supposed to be because you are forged by your circumstances. When the world says a thing is a way, you can either go with it or rebel against it. Those who rebel against it can become either trendsetters, martyrs, victims, or visionaries. The people that are not happy accepting the status quo for what it is can become outlaws. But sometimes those people are the things that we need to move forward. Sometimes they can set us back as well because, well, not all differences are good. But often, change is the catalyst to move forward. Change is also something that we are the most afraid of. So why are we afraid of moving forward? Because it's different. Why is difference scary? Because it's not something that we know. And that is the entire basis that the humankind uses to draw apart rather than together. Because you can't tell what another person is thinking necessarily, unless you're a psychology major, and even then, there's a certain je ne sais quoi, there's an art to getting it wrong and moving forward, and also getting it right, but only getting it right to a certain extent. I want to say that the reason that psychology can work is because it's vague, tangential in a lot of ways. It's sort of just an idea rather than a physical thing, if that makes any sense. A lot of people try and say that it is the ideologue, the art form, the science dedicated to religion, which is a very a weird concept. When I look at psychology, I see a tool that could be used to draw people together. And that's by and large what it tends to do. But the problem there is that you can only do so with people who are willing to accept help. And those who are willing to accept help aren't always the ones who are most in need of it. A wise man once told me, you shouldn't necessarily prioritize the person in the room that you want to help. You should prioritize the one that seems to need it the least, because they're the one who is going to need it the most. That's quite an interesting thing to try and internalize, though, because there are different states of being for every human, and what I interpret as the one most in need is not going to be the same as what somebody else interprets as the most in need. So this would have to be something that is applied in a global conceptualization, which, if that were a thing that were possible, if that were the way the world worked, the world would be a very different place. For better or for worse. The problem is, those who are not trained in the art of helping can do more damage than good, and even those who are trained in the art of helping can still do more damage than good if they, well, accidents happen every day. Nobody's perfect, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. Perfection would be quite a hindrance. Perfection would make us stagnate. So in that way, perfection is not something to be sought after, because if we were to try and attain perfection, well, we end up coming up with these allegories, these versions of history that we will never be able to achieve, that never existed, that tend to be things that religion is based off of, because they are, quote-unquote, the purest forms of things. You can have the purest form of a good thing or the purest form of an evil thing. It doesn't make it any less pure. Or technically, if you think of it this way, there's no such thing as good or evil, so it's just the pure form of something that people attribute to a good thing or a bad thing. So you could say chaos in its truest form is embodied by humanity because it is so very unpredictable, can be very constructive, can be very destructive. As people would say, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. Humankind have the capability to create. They have the capability to destroy, not in entirety, but they have the ability to destroy. Although it becomes fundamentally different when you think about it on a global and then universal scale, because is there a fundamental difference between our ability to destroy, if you look at it from the conceptualization of multiple planets? Our planet only has a limited amount of resources on it, which is not a fact that you can just walk away from. There are gases that escape our atmosphere, and then we are just unable to ever get those back. They are a dwindling resource. It's something that could be very scary to people. We have not only genocided specific types of animals, But now we're on the route to performing genocide on minerals. Helium, to be specific. One of the building blocks for all of humanity, well, all of the world, is hydrogen. And hydrogen we'll probably never get rid of, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we won't, considering hydrogen typically turns into helium, and helium has been rapidly escaping from our planet because it just goes up and then it leaves, and we have no way of getting it back. Aside from potentially constructing some out of hydrogen, which that is fundamentally a poor idea. But anyway, let's get off of the tangent of the world. The world is the world. We may be a weird growth upon the world, acting upon it, drawing its resources out from it, using that upon it, so that it is, we can be a damaging thing, we can be a good thing, but ultimately, I think that the world may outlive humanity, with as much as she has gone through the world, with as much as she has gone through and continued to survive. I think she will be able to inhabit life for longer than humans will, because humans are a very greedy, spiteful species. They literally want it all, to the point where they think that it would be more worthwhile to destroy everything, because that is an all. And if you destroy everything, somebody else cannot have an all. It's a very narrow viewpoint, but it's an inescapable part of humanity. As long as we have greed, which greed has arguable uses. If you didn't have greed, everyone would be selfless and probably suicidal by accident. But then the extent of greed in its truest form is something that is so ravenously destructive. You could say that it is the cause for almost everything. I was having this conversation with somebody, and I was trying to argue that greed was the root of all problems with humanity. Their counter-argument was that abuse was the root of all problems with humanity. And I think there's a certain something to be said for that. It's hard to conceptualize, though. You can't just, well, if you abuse greed, if you abuse anything, it is inherently incorrect. But how does one conceptualize something like abuse in a world where we are living on our 7 virtues, 7 deadly sins? A world where you'd have to break down the term abuse. I think this is the first time I've actually sat down and thought about it. What is the categorical definition of abuse? Abuse. To use something to bad effect or bad purpose. To misuse. Or secondarily, treat a person or animal with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. That's as the verb. As a noun, the improper use of something, and also cruel and violent treatment of a person or animal. Synonyms: mistreatment, maltreatment, ill-treatment, misuse, misemploy, misapply. Abuse is a very, very broad, yet very simple concept. If you think about it, almost anything could be considered an abuse of some variety. I mean, the FDA is an abuse of power in that it lists very specific information that people internalize incorrectly because they are not properly informed. This is an abuse of one of your freedoms because you have a freedom of ignorance. But why do we have a freedom of ignorance when ignorance of the law is not an excuse that can keep you out of jail? To what extent are our freedoms allowed? We bring up a different argument that was stated in a different time. Freedom of speech. How deep does freedom of speech go? Freedom of speech goes until it becomes about abuse. It's kind of funny. I never really would have thought of this if I hadn't had this conversation with this person. But the freedom of speech is by and large regulated in the idea that it goes until it steps on somebody else's toes to the point where it either would cause them to be unable to do something, or it causes them physical violence. So that would be an abuse of public speaking. Whereas you've got the Jordan Peterson approach. He believes that it is an abuse of the idea of public speaking to force people to use specific pronouns. I will neither rally with or against this notion. It is simply a fact that this is his viewpoint. Or this is what I have understood of his viewpoint. This is why I don't want to talk about it, because it's something that I feel that there is more to this issue than can just be summarily, circumstantially applied to a conversational thread of this manner. It's not so simple as one view. I think the entire world is a whole variety. I think the world is, what's the word? A spectrum. It's not such thing as good and bad. It's a spectrum of intention versus ideology, in my opinion. The world exists in a constant state of flux because humans are people that do their best in strife. If humans get lazy, they become unproductive, and unproductive humans are prone to things such as cancer, all the deadly sins, abuse, problems that will really only largely become a problem for humanity, while those who are more proactive in their most extreme forms can end up having problems that will affect not only humanity, but the earth itself and the other species living upon it. Genocide. Theoretically, we as a species would have the ability to crack the earth in half if we tried hard enough, if we wanted it badly enough. Nobody wants that because nobody so far has been selfish enough to go behind the idea, the dogmatic ideology, the theory that, well, if I'm having a bad time, everyone should just die because I think so. Nobody really thinks that way. Well, not in this day and age. Or at least if they do, they're not allowed to have high enough positions of power. Thankfully. Maybe we've just been lucky. Maybe this is a specific timeline that's trying to underline a very specific idea. Who knows? There's probably multiple other different timelines where things didn't quite work out the way they work out now. There's timelines where the people that I know now aren't the people that I do know. But I'm thankful for the way things are right now. Perhaps it's greedy of me. In a weird way. Is it greedy to enjoy the hand you're dealt? Is it greedy to believe that the world works a specific way and that it ends up being fulfilling to your ideas? What are your ideas? What are my ideas? What is the world? Who am I? Who are you? Why are we here? Philosophy is a very interesting idea. Philosophy is a very interesting school of thinking, in that it asks questions that nobody ever wanted actual answers for, but eventually we may have. And by that time, they won't matter anymore.